Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
On the 7th of December, 1941, hundreds of Japanese aircraft launched a devastating surprise attack on America's Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The assault resulted in thousands of American deaths and massive losses to the U.S. Pacific Fleet, paralyzing their forces in the region for months to come. But it wasn't the complete knockout blow that the Japanese had hoped for, and ended up waking the sleeping giant of America from its slumber and dooming Imperial Japan to ultimate defeat. So why did they do it? And how did Japanese miscalculations on that day seal their fate in World War II? To fully understand Japan's motivations, we have to go back to the mid-19th century. For centuries, up until the mid-1800s, Japan was ruled by powerful warlords called shogun, who kept Japan isolated from the rest of the world. However, that would soon change. In 1852, the Americans, who by now were well into their Industrial Revolution, wanted to expand trade in the East. So they sent 4 massive modern steel warships to Japan, demanding that Japanese ports be opened for US ships and that American diplomats be granted a permanent presence in the land. For the Japanese, who had not yet gone through an industrial revolution themselves, the sight of these modern warships struck absolute terror into their hearts. They called them the Black Ships, or Korofune, and they would mark the end of Japan's centuries-long era of seclusion. With the Americans threatening hostilities if the terms were not accepted, Japan had no choice but to agree or face devastation, as there was no way they could defeat such advanced technology. As a result of this sense of helplessness, Japan embarked on a massive campaign to study America and the West, in hopes of uncovering for themselves what made them so advanced and powerful, so they too could become strong and avoid another similar event. Starting in the 1860s, the Japanese began sending students to the West to study Western ways of life, including science, medicine, and law. This resulted in an era of new Japanese reformers, poised to launch Japan into their own industrial age. In 1868, the shogun, whose stature took a major blow after the inability to deal with the Black Ships, was overthrown. The reformers would install 15-year-old Emperor Meiji in the shogun's place, cementing their new regime, and ushering in a period which would come to be known as the Meiji Restoration. The new Meiji government wasted little time and began rapidly modernizing Japan. They increased the amount of people they sent to the West, gathering further knowledge about Western ways. Eventually, they would recognize that developing modern technology and adopting Western economic, political, and civil institutions wasn't enough if Japan was to truly thrive. They realized that all the major powers in the world, such as Britain, France, and America, had massive empires, with lots of land, abundant in natural resources, and huge militaries to uphold it all. So for Japan to become a major world player, the Meiji reformers believed that creating a huge Japanese empire was a must, as the Japanese mainland alone didn't have the natural resources needed to raise them to such heights. As a result, in 1873, conscription was enforced, and the army and navy would undergo massive expansion and modernization in preparation for territorial conquest. The balance of power in Asia was changing, and the first steps toward an eventual showdown with America had been taken. Japan's first major step in building an empire came when they invaded Korea, which at the time was a tributary state to China. To Japan, control of Korea would offer the perfect base for future expansion into Asia and prevent the Russians, who were also keen, from expanding into the region themselves. The invasion resulted in war with China, the First Sino-Japanese War, in 1894. Japan rapidly defeated China in 8 months and forced the Korean king to install a Japanese puppet state. The Liaodong Peninsula and the island of Formosa also came under Japanese control. The Russians weren't happy about this though, and together with France and Germany, demanded that the Liaodong Peninsula be given back to China, which the Japanese unenthusiastically agreed to. To rub salt into the wound, Russia took control of the area themselves 3 years later, reflecting that the Russians, and the West in general, weren't to be trusted. As a result, Japan would increase the scale and speed of their military build-up, so they would have the muscle to fend off any future Western intervention as their goal of empire building continued. Tension between Russia and Japan would grow when both nations looked to expand into the Chinese region of Manchuria. Unlike the Russians, for whom controlling Manchuria was a vanity project of sorts, Japan saw it as a vital step in their mission to create an empire. It was abundant in natural resources, crucial for military expansion and industrialization, including iron, coal, oil, and lumber. The Russians began by extending their Trans-Siberian Railway into the region, which a group of Chinese rebels, called the Boxers, would eventually target in efforts to rid the land of foreign presence. After destroying a decent chunk of it, the Russians would invade and eventually occupy the province in 1900. This was a disaster for Japan. To secure Manchuria, they would now have to do it by force, leading to full-blown conflict with the Russians and the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. Long story short, Japan won, and were granted control of the southern part of the Sakhalin Island and South Manchuria. Japan had finally defeated a strong European nation, marking their arrival as a force to be reckoned with on the world stage. Japan's status as a major power would be enhanced again during World War I, when they fought alongside the victorious Allied forces. They ended up coming away with control of even more territory, including the Marshall, Caroline and Mariana Island chains in the Pacific, as well as China's Shandong province. Their territorial gains and imperial ambitions didn't go unnoticed by the Americans, however, who by now felt that their interests in the Pacific were under threat. After winning the Spanish-American War in 1898, the US had control over Guam and the Philippines. So to protect these territorial and economic interests, the Americans would set out to safeguard Chinese sovereignty, to ensure the Chinese market and trade, the biggest market in the East, would remain open to them. So they laid out a series of treaties to do just that in the years following World War I. All nations involved in the treaties, including Japan, had to ensure that Chinese sovereignty wouldn't be infringed upon and that the Chinese market would remain open equally to everyone. However, another term of the treaty stipulated that Japan had to give the Shandong province back to China, a territory they had only just won during World War I. When the Japanese Prime Minister Hara Takashi accepted the terms, a sense of humiliation and anger swept Japan, particularly among Japanese nationalists, who yet again saw this as egregious Western interference. As a result, the Prime Minister was assassinated, ushering in the rise of hardcore Japanese nationalism and a government extremely influenced by the military. In 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed and American banks collapsed, leading to the Great Depression over the next several years. Unemployment and poverty soared, not only in America, but the entire world. Japan, whose economy relied heavily on exports to America, was hit extremely hard. Their export market was decimated virtually instantly. Hardship and unrest spread like wildfire, and much of the Japanese population felt that their leaders had let them down. Just as in Germany and Italy, the Japanese now looked to authoritarian and military leadership, who promised economic recovery through territorial expansion. They stressed that Japan would need to claim more land and resources in Asia to rid themselves of their reliance on Western trade and establish themselves as a truly independent nation. China would be the land they looked to expand into, in particular, the resource-dense remaining part of Manchuria. However, this path would put them on a collision course for an eventual showdown with America during World War II. In September 1931, Japan invaded northern Manchuria, completing the occupation of the region by early 1932. They wouldn't stop there, though. Over the coming years, the Japanese edged their way further into China until full-scale war broke out in 1937, marking the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Initially, the Japanese had great success, winning countless victories and pushing deep into Chinese territory. As they advanced, they would commit war crimes and atrocities, such as the infamous rape of Nanking, which caused huge international uproar. By 1939, however, Japanese progress stalled considerably, and a stalemate formed, as the Chinese began to sort themselves out. By this point, the conflict was becoming a major drain on Japanese resources and manpower, so with no easy way forward, they would have to look elsewhere to conquer the land and resources needed for victory, and to continue building their much-desired empire. Over the Pacific, the Americans were growing concerned with events in China. After World War I, the US adopted unofficial policies of isolationism and non-interventionism. In short, the majority of the population had no interest in another huge war, either in Europe or Asia, which to them seemed an entire world away. They greatly reduced the size of their army and navy, stayed out of alliances that could have drawn them into conflict, and wouldn't provide aid to the allies they already had. In the 1930s, this in fact became official, when US Congress passed a series of neutrality acts. However, by 1939, the outbreak of World War II in Europe and the mounting Japanese atrocities in China swayed the American masses back in favor of a stance of interventionism. American President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed off on a new Neutrality Act, declaring that France and Britain could now purchase American arms if they sailed across the Atlantic in their own ships and picked them up themselves. The Lend-Lease Act followed a couple of years later in 1941. This allowed the US, as the name suggests, to lend or lease war material to any nation they deemed pivotal to American security, and they eventually started supplying the USSR and China. So whilst on paper, America was still technically neutral, it was clear that they had picked their side. For Japan, that spelled bad news. By this stage, the most important resource the Japanese needed to continue on their path of expansion was oil. In 1939, 94% of their oil was imported, 80% came from America alone. If their oil supply was to run dry or be cut off, they could say goodbye to victory in China and any other ambitions of conquest. In addition, Japan also needed resources such as coal, scrap metal and iron, all of which also had to be imported, and again the majority was coming from America. In order to get these resources and free themselves from their reliance on America, Japan had to make a choice between what would come to be known as the Northern and Southern strategies. The Northern strategy was to invade resource-rich lands in Siberia, Mongolia and China. The Southern strategy was to expand southward into the similarly resource-rich Dutch East Indies and British Malaya. The Northern strategy was in fact already well underway by the mid-1930s, with the aforementioned occupation of Manchuria and expansion into China. However, this led to border tensions with the Soviets, which came to a head at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939, where combined Mongolian-Soviet forces ended up defeating the Japanese. Couple this with the stalemate that formed in China, and Japanese expansion northward became unfeasible. As a result, the Japanese shifted their focus to their southern strategy. Japan's push southward started in September 1940, when they, in agreement with the Vichy French government, moved into northern French Indochina, cutting off an important Chinese supply route. The Americans viewed this as another act of aggression that endangered their Pacific interests. Around the same time, the Japanese entered the Tripartite Pact, joining forces with Italy and Nazi Germany. In response, the US enforced an embargo on the Japanese, cutting them off from the trade of copper, iron and steel, resources which were vital in keeping Japan's war machine running. However, this didn't stop the Japanese from occupying more of French Indochina in July 1941. The US would respond again, but this time they hit Japan where it really hurt, freezing all Japanese assets in America and cutting off all oil trade with them. Soon after this, the Dutch and British imposed oil embargoes of their own on the Japanese. So in one devastating blow, Japan was cut off from over 90% of its oil supply. Japan was now between a rock and a hard place. Initially, they tried to negotiate with America, who demanded that Japan pull out of both the Tripartite Pact and from China. However, these terms were unacceptable for the Japanese. They had already sunk so many resources and men into their imperial ambitions, and giving up their gains now would have been a humiliating defeat in their eyes. They felt the only way forward was to take the land and resources they needed by force, which meant continuing their push south into the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya, whom were both friendly with America. This time around, Japan had no doubt that the US would reply with force. So to beat them to the punch and knock the wind out of them before they could strike a major blow, they decided to attack America's Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. In doing so, they believed they could incapacitate the US fleet long enough to claim the territory they desired in the south and set up their defenses without the threat of US counterattacks. It was a huge risk. The Japanese knew the chances of winning a long war with America were slim to none. They are hoping that the blow at Pearl Harbor will be enough to kill any American ambition of a lengthy and costly conflict all the way over the Pacific against a dug-in enemy, and that they would instead negotiate peace terms in which the Japanese could keep some, if not all, of the land they conquered. At about 8 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, the initial wave of over 180 Japanese aircraft began their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The Americans were completely caught off guard. The assault was split into 3 groups. 2 of the 3 groups, including Japanese fighters and dive bombers, targeted the island's airbase, decimating hangars and parked aircraft. To prevent sabotage, US planes were parked wingtip to wingtip, which made them sitting ducks. The 3rd group, including torpedo bombers and bombers, targeted ships in the harbor. The Americans thought the water in the harbor wasn't deep enough for torpedo attacks. However, the Japanese had developed a special kind of torpedo for the shallow waters at Pearl Harbor, which ended up annihilating US ships. Only several minutes into the assault, 4 battleships had been struck, including the USS Arizona, which exploded soon after, taking nearly 1,200 of its crew with it. About an hour later, just before 9 a.m., the second wave of 170 Japanese aircraft struck. The Americans were now on high alert, though, leading to this wave having less success. However, in less than 90 minutes after the initial attack had begun, 18 US warships had been either sunk or damaged. 188 aircraft were destroyed, and the base itself sustained massive damage. Unfortunately for the Japanese, though, all 3 US aircraft carriers, the most important ships in the entire fleet, were not at the harbour during the attack and survived to fight another day, which would come back to bite the Japanese in the long run. So with no aircraft carriers to hit, the Japanese defaulted to targeting battleships. They wanted a short war, so taking out the battleships would prevent the Americans from immediately striking back in the Pacific, which the Japanese are hoping will lead to peace negotiations. What they don't concentrate on enough, though, is destroying American repair shops and fuel depots, which were crucial in allowing the US to bounce back from the devastation and pursue a longer war. In addition, due to the shallow waters at Pearl Harbor, the ships that ended up sinking didn't go far and were much easier to recover and eventually repair. So although the Japanese had struck a devastating blow, the vital heart of the US Pacific Fleet was still beating. On the same day as Pearl Harbor, the Japanese moved on territories in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Almost instantly, Thailand surrendered and formed an alliance with Japan. The British-controlled territories of Hong Kong and Malaya, in addition to the US-controlled Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam, fell soon after too. Not to mention, 2 British warships were sunk by Japanese torpedoes near Malaya. Early in 1942, Japan continued their push into the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, British-controlled Burma, the Solomon Islands, and New Guinea, with the Americans unable to strike back so soon after Pearl Harbor, just as Japan had hoped. So, Japan had at last achieved their nearly 90-year-long desire for an empire and natural resources. However, there was a major problem they hadn't counted on. The Americans had no interest in a negotiated peace. The day following the attack on Pearl Harbor, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt gives his Day of Infamy speech and asks Congress to formally declare war on Japan, which all but one member of Congress agrees to. The desire for isolationism had evaporated, and the military and economy began being rapidly geared up for war. Japan's hopes for a short war had gone with the wind. They had poked the bear, awoken the sleeping giant, and as they say, the rest is history. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe.